After the release of Metal Gear Solid 4, Hideo Kojima started coming up with some ideas for a new Metal Gear game. One of these was a game that would feature the boss and the rest of the Cobra Unit as main characters, showcasing what they were up to before the events of Metal Gear Solid 3. However, a member of the team suggested to Kojima that he should turn this game into a side story focused on Raiden, telling the story of his transformation into a cyborg ninja between the events of MGS 2 and 4. Kojima loved the idea, and the game would enter pre-production under the working title of Metal Gear Solid Rising, and Kojima would pretty quickly go on to tease it at a keynote presentation in 2009, with him announcing that it would be the next Metal Gear Solid title. He and his team would work on the game for about 2 years, but they were finding it difficult to work on due to how different it was from previous Metal Gear titles, and eventually, the game was handed over to director Kenji Saito and his team at PlatinumGames to be completed. The game's title was then changed to Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, with the Revengeance subtitle coming from Kojima Productions' desire to, and I quote, get revenge or vengeance on the original failed Metal Gear Solid Rising project. The game would undergo significant changes to its mechanics and storyline under the leadership of PlatinumGames, but all the changes that were made were done so with the approval of Kojima Productions, and the game would eventually be released in February of 2013. So, would Metal Gear Rising turn out to be a hit with longtime fans like the original team had hoped? Or would the stress of moving from studio to studio do too much damage to the final product? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 15th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for Metal Gear Delta. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is an action-adventure game developed by PlatinumGames and published by Konami for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2013. And right off the bat here, I have a small confession to make. I've been saying throughout this whole series that I had never played the Metal Gear games, but that's not entirely true, as I've actually played through Metal Gear Rising once before. Back when COVID first hit and we all went into lockdown, I had nothing to do other than just kind of sit around and play games all day, as my school and place of work were both obviously closed at the time. And we're talking right at the beginning of COVID, when we all thought that the lockdown was going to be like 2 weeks, so everything just totally shut down instead of going remote or online. So I picked up MGR on a Steam sale, binged through it in like 2 days, and then never touched it again. So I just wanted to have this at the start of the video for you guys to know that this is the one time in this series that I will actually have played the game before, although I don't really remember much aside from some small things that I liked, and the fact that most of the story went over my head as I had never played another Metal Gear game before it. Anyway, the story opens with Raiden in Africa 4 years after the events of MGS4, meeting with the Prime Minister of a thriving unnamed nation who refers to Raiden as Mr. Lightning Bolt. A very cheeky reference to my favorite line of dialogue in Metal Gear Solid 4. It's revealed here that Raiden is working with a PMC called Maverick, and they've been working as a security force for this nation's government. After some small introductions, a cyborg ninja suddenly appears in the road, blocking our convoy's path. He's warned to clear the way before he suddenly attacks the front vehicle, splitting the gunner in half with his blade. We try to escape with the Prime Minister before more men appear to aid the ninja's attack, and Raiden steps out of the car, throwing off his suit and drawing his HF blade that he still has from MGS2. And I have to say, this over-the-top badass entrance of his perfectly sets the tone for the rest of this wacky journey that we're about to go on. So if you happen to be one of the 4 people watching this who's not familiar with the game beforehand, buckle up because this one gets pretty crazy pretty fast. We get a bit of combat against these other cyborgs, and the first thing that has to be said here is that the combos and general flow of combat in this game feel and look incredible. They're also really simple and accessible for players who are new to the genre, with only 2 buttons really being required to get smooth and flashy combos going. The X button on the controller is bound to your light attacks, while the Y button is bound to your heavy attacks, and simply pressing these 2 buttons in specific orders will get you totally unique moves and combo strings. There is more depth available here for players who want to move beyond these simple combos, with some moves being completely disconnected from combo strings and having more complex inputs such as pulling the thumbstick back and then forward before pressing X, but these are more niche moves that you'll only really use if you're digging super deep into the combat system. Is it as deep and rewarding as combo systems in other character action games like Devil May Cry? No. But is it really smooth and fun to play with on top of being accessible for less experienced players? Absolutely. If you're new to character action games, you'll totally be able to get cool combos going with just a little bit of time spent in the game, and even if you're a veteran of the genre, it still manages to be rewarding enough to keep you from getting bored with it. They struck an awesome balance here, and it really doesn't get as much praise as it should. Something else that really helps the combat feel smooth is the blocking system they have here. When an enemy attack is coming in, players can flick the left thumbstick in the direction of said enemy and press the attack button for Raiden to block the attack, completely negating the incoming damage as well as keeping your combo count going. Along with this, if you block just before the attack connects with Raiden, you'll instead get a parry, which will also give you a counterattack that either just deals damage back to the enemy, or if it hits a weaker enemy, opens them up for an instant kill. It's very weird to get used to at first, and there's definitely a bit of a learning curve to it, but once you get used to canceling out of your combo moves to block or parry an attack, it feels so good to quickly block or counterattack an enemy and just keep your combo going. Part of this is definitely the reward of learning a tricky mechanic, but also the visual and auditory feedback for a good block here is just perfect. And I know that those of you who aren't familiar with the game were just blown away by what happened after that parry, so allow me to explain. This is called Blade Mode, and it's a very central mechanic to the game. By holding the left trigger on the controller, players will be put into Blade Mode, which allows them to freely slice and dice their enemies by pressing X on the controller for a horizontal slice, Y for a vertical slice, or you can flick the right thumbstick in a specific direction for a custom swing. This is great for finishing off enemies, it's often used to give interesting mechanics to larger enemies or boss fights, and as you just saw, looks and feels absolutely amazing to engage with. So all up, we're only about 5 minutes into playing the game so far, and the core combat here is already pretty awesome. And you shouldn't need me to tell you, but that's normally a good sign for a game like this. After cutting through the first handful of enemies and getting a feel for the combat, a Metal Gear ray suddenly leaps out of the water, firing off a laser that flips the Prime Minister's car. Just after this, another cyborg ninja appears, quickly dealing with the PM's security guards and taking him from the car. We go to stop him, and when he notices us, he says that we must be Jack. Raiden asks what he wants, and he tells him that he wants to kill the Prime Minister, saying that Africa has just been a little too peaceful lately. He explains that ever since they shut down the SOP system, business just hasn't been the same, asking how an honest warmonger is supposed to make a living in this economy. He quickly escapes, calling in the Metal Gear Ray to keep us busy, already giving us our first boss fight of the game. Now, going toe-to-toe with a Metal Gear Ray might seem like a daunting task, but this is actually a pretty easy boss. We need to chase it around the arena and attack its feet, and every once in a while, it will lift one of its feet to try to stomp us, giving players an opportunity to get to grips with the basic controls and movement mechanics of the game. After dealing a significant amount of damage to Ray, we're able to use Blade Mode to jump up and slash away at pieces of its armor, leading to a boss that's incredibly satisfying to slowly chip away at. And once its health is really low, it swings a large blade down at us, but we manage to catch it, giving us one of the most insane quicktime events I've ever seen in a video game. Every boss fight in the game ends with a crazy QTE sequence like this, and man, even the most outspoken QuickTime event haters have to love these. They aren't a replacement for the fight itself, rather they're more like a crazy cinematic reward for having already defeated the boss, and they just look incredible. Anyway, once we've taken down the Metal Gear Ray, we chase after the cyborg, eventually finding him running away, and here we get a chase sequence using the game's new ninja run mechanic. If you've ever played an older Assassin's Creed game before, you're very familiar with how this mechanic works, with players simply being able to hold down the right trigger on their controller to not only run faster, but also traverse most obstacles that will get in their way. There are some times where it's a little janky, but for the most part, it looks really cool and perfectly does its job of making you feel even more like the badass cyborg ninja you are. As we're chasing after him though, the Metal Gear Ray leaps back in from off screen, apparently still being functional after our fight. We get a second boss fight against the thing here, this time being locked into a much smaller area, with the boss throwing out attacks that teach players how to do things like time their jumps, or even use blade mode to defend themselves against larger projectiles. There are also some attacks in here that will need to be blocked or parried, but you can pretty easily get through this fight without blocking a single one. When Ray's health gets low again, it jumps back, launching a barrage of missiles at us, and Raiden starts to quite literally run and jump across the missiles to catch up to it, hacking away at Ray once again before being grabbed and thrown up at the clock tower above us. We then get a set piece where we run down the side of the collapsing clock tower while avoiding Ray's lasers and missiles before slicing the thing in half straight down the middle to finally destroy it. I mean, talk about opening your game with a bang. And of course, those of you familiar with the game have been waiting for me to talk about the music since before you even clicked on the video. Metal Gear Rising has a fantastic soundtrack all around, but it really hits its peak during the boss fights. Beyond just being really good boss fight music, these tracks also feature full vocals, and the lyrics of the songs reflect the boss that you're fighting. And they aren't just amazing while playing the game either, they're also just great songs to listen to on their own. While I don't remember much about actually playing the game years ago, there are numerous tracks from MGR that I listen to on a regular basis, with one of these being Metal Gear Ray's theme, Rules of Nature. I mean, just listen to this. Anyway, we see the cyborg from earlier jump onto a train, and Raiden quickly chases after him, finding that both cyborg ninjas are waiting on the train for him. The larger one tells us that he won't be needing the Prime Minister any longer, and we go to stop him from killing him, but the first cyborg jumps in to stop us, and the larger one impales the PM through the back with his blade. The larger one is then extracted by Chopper, referring to the other cyborg as Sam and telling him that we're all his. We try to fight Sam, but he's constantly dodging all of our attacks and quickly counterattacking, making him effectively impossible to land a hit on. He tells Raiden that his blade yearns to bathe in the blood of his enemies, yet he holds it back, but Raiden argues that his sword is a tool of justice. God, this dialogue is cheesy even for Metal Gear standards, and I absolutely love it. We continue to fight with him before he quite literally shoots his sword out of its sheath, taking Raiden's left arm clean off. We tried desperately to fight back, but the blood loss is clearly getting to Raiden, and just when it seems like Sam is going to finish us off, some Maverick trucks arrive. They shoot at him, forcing him to retreat into the same chopper the last cyborg did, and they manage to get away from us before we can shoot them down. Raiden lays there defeated before eventually passing out from the blood loss. Which, by the way, something that I caught here is that his blood is red again instead of being white like it was in MGS4. I'm sure this was just a design choice by PlatinumGames, but it still struck me as a bit of a weird change. We then cut to 3 weeks later, with Raiden flying over the ocean in some sort of jet. We get a call from a man Raiden calls Doctor, who tells Raiden that he has two ways of maintaining his new body, those being using generic repair kits or extracting the electrolytes from the body fluids of enemy cyborgs. He also asks us to retrieve their left hands if we can, saying that their holographic memory is typically stored in them, and offering to pay us in upgraded equipment for doing so. We get another call from a man named Kev, who gives us a quick briefing on the mission. He explains that our job is to go into the country of Abkhazia and neutralize the terrorist threat present there so we can restore the rightful government. The president of Maverick, Boris, then steps in, explaining that the leader of the occupying forces has been linked to numerous terrorist attacks over the last few years, and that his arms supplier is none other than Desperado Enforcement LLC, with Raiden mentioning that they're the group that we saw in Africa during the opening. Kev tells us that our most immediate threat is Jetstream Sam, but Raiden says that with his new enhancements, Sam shouldn't be an issue this time. We then see Raiden get shot out of the drone, deploying onto the beach, and fully revealing his new design, which I absolutely love. It has such a clean, angular look to it, and brings Raiden from looking like any other cyborg ninja we've seen in the series before to looking more like a superhero. And in general, while the visual fidelity in Metal Gear Rising is slightly lower than what we saw in Metal Gear Solid 4, the art style and general presentation of the game more than makes up for it. A big part of this definitely comes from the fact that since PlatinumGames and Kojima Productions were working together on this project, series art director Yoji Shinkawa was directly involved in the character design process for the game. This means that not only does Raiden have a great design, but other major characters in the game do as well, and thanks to PlatinumGames' history of working on over-the-top action games like Bayonetta and Vanquish, the team knew exactly how to approach things like flashy cutscene direction and character animation. But with Raiden's new body, much like Dr. said, we can now extract the electrolytes of other cyborgs to heal ourselves. This introduces a new mechanic called Zandatsu, which allows us to do just that. When an enemy's health is low enough, players can activate blade mode and slash across the highlighted target to reveal the enemy's electrolyte storage, which in the case of generic cyborgs, just so happens to be their spines, allowing Raiden to rip them out and crush them in his hand to absorb the energy. And yes, ripping an enemy's spine out and crushing it mid-combo looks so badass. A successful Zandatsu will not only refill Raiden's health, but it will also fully recharge the energy that he uses for blade mode, meaning that finishing an enemy off with Zandatsu will immediately put you at an advantage for the rest of the encounter. Players who regularly use Zandatsu are rewarded heavily for doing so, forming a very addictive gameplay loop around a very fun and satisfying mechanic. The only real downside here is that the camera during the ripping animation often clips through the environment, meaning there are a lot of times where you won't actually get to see the big satisfying finisher because you're staring at the backside of a wall instead. It doesn't really affect the gameplay, but it definitely affects how cool your combos look, which is very important in a game like this. After adjusting to the new body a bit, we get a call from Kev, and Raiden tells him that Intel wasn't exaggerating about the cyborg count. Kev explains that cyborgs lead to a much stronger military, but without the risk of AI or drone malfunctions, so PMCs have been gravitating towards them more and more. Raiden says that with this new body of his, they're basically walking vending machines, and Kev tries to remind him that they're still people. Raiden argues that they're people who willingly chose to take innocent lives for money, saying that they sealed their fate when they took this job, and we go on to find the leader of the terrorists. As we're moving through the level, we're also introduced to the game's light stealth mechanics. They aren't very fleshed out, with enemies just having simple vision cones that players need to avoid to stay undetected, and Raiden simply being able to execute instant takedowns from behind or above an enemy. Stealth was probably included just to give it some stronger ties to the Metal Gear name, and while it's not a strong stealth system by any means, it can be fun for a couple minutes at a time should you choose to engage with it, and since it's never required to progress, I'm not exactly going to complain about it being included as an option. As I'm messing around with the stealth a little bit, I suddenly get ambushed by a gecko, which immediately put a smile on my face. Back in MGS4, we got to see Raiden single-handedly fighting Gecko, while no one else in the game was actually capable of doing anything close to this. Things like this really just go to show that the team at PlatinumGames were clearly fans of the series, as they've not only included them as basic enemies here, but also introduced them as early as the second level, allowing fans of MGS4 to actually play out the fantasy of fighting Gecko as a cyborg ninja. And the cherry on top is that while they're definitely more dangerous than the average cyborg, they're not really that hard to take down, which just makes it feel even more consistent with what we saw back in Metal Gear Solid 4. Just after this, I find a small computer sitting in the corner of a room, and interacting with it unlocks one of MGR's many VR missions. These are unlocked by simply finding these computers in the campaign levels, and once you've unlocked them, they can be played at any time, either during the campaign or from the main menu of the game. The quality of them can vary a lot, with some being straightforward and fun combat challenges, and some of them have more specific gimmicks like destroying targets with grenades or needing to clear a stealth encounter without getting spotted. They're a fun little throwback to the VR mission expansion that MGS1 got, but if you're the sort of person who likes to 100% your games, be warned, some of these are incredibly frustrating to complete, let alone get the highest rank on. Overall, they're a fun distraction for the average player, and a potential headache for completionists. Moving forward though, we encounter an AI-controlled wolf weapon of some sort who tells us that he possesses an intellect far beyond that of the average human. Raiden jokingly asks him what the meaning of life is, and the wolf says that he's here to kill us. Raiden jokes again that that's pretty simple thinking for such a high intellect, and the wolf says that if it were to disobey a direct order, its memory would be wiped. Raiden asks him what good an intellect is if he can't use it, but the wolf has had enough of his taunting, and we get into the second boss fight of the game. The wolf is an incredibly agile fighter, and it isn't affected by hit stun or stagger mechanics very much, meaning that if players want to have any hope of getting through this fight, they'll have to get pretty good at blocking or parrying its attacks. Outside of that, it does retreat from us and call some adds in from time to time, but it's mostly here to serve as a skill check and make sure that you've learned how to block by this point in the game, or if you haven't, teach you to before you're allowed to continue. At the end of the fight, the wolf begs for its life before we chop it to bits. We then get one last signal from the wolf as its AI is dying, with it repeating its directive over and over, saying that it has no freedom before the signal cuts out. Just after this, we're ambushed by attack choppers, giving us another ninja run spectacle where we run across a collapsing bridge to escape them. Once at the end of the bridge, we get into a fight against the choppers, and this is where my biggest complaint with the core combat comes into play, that being that I find the flying enemies in this game beyond annoying. Raiden's air combo potential is incredibly limited, and his jumping feels very loose and floaty on top of that, leading to fights against aerial opponents just feeling incredibly janky compared to the game's otherwise tight and polished combat. These fights can be made easier by using RPGs found in the environment, but these are limited one-time use items, and unfortunately, don't really make up for the general awkwardness of these encounters. Back to the story though, we eventually get visual confirmation of the leader of the terrorists, with him seemingly being angry with a woman. He storms off, and the woman then turns around and makes eye contact with us, blowing Raiden a kiss before suddenly disappearing. We make our way over to the refinery we saw them standing on top of, eventually reaching the rooftop and finding the woman. She greets Raiden as Jack the Ripper, introducing herself as Mistral. She says that our reputation as a natural-born killer precedes us, explaining that she was born in France and they had their own civil war in the 90s, in which she lost her whole family. She then tells Raiden that she butchered her family's killers, which made her realize that she was a natural-born killer as well. Raiden asks her if she's proud of that, and she says that she actually found it quite boring, as she did with all killing after that point due to how easy it was for her, until she met him. She says that his ideals gave her life meaning, asking Raiden what his ideals are, with him responding that he protects the weak. And I found her vaguely referencing someone as him and talking about ideals to be really interesting, as normally I would have just interpreted this as being some sort of vague foreshadowing for a character later in the game, but this time around, I actually wondered if she had met and trained under Big Boss, as he's been vaguely referred to in a similar way throughout the series. She then suddenly rips the arms off of a nearby Scarab bot, attaching them together to form some sort of pole arm, before other Scarab bots jump onto her back, attaching their arms to the mechanical spine that she has, which she then uses to control those arms, giving her effectively like 15 different arms, and here we get our third boss fight of the game. This one is pretty good as well, with players still needing to use the block and parry skills that they learned during the wolf fight, but now there's an additional mechanic added in where if you use blade mode to hit her polearm in just the right spot, you can split it in half, disarming her for a short amount of time. It's not necessary to hit these accurate blade mode slices, but it does introduce and potentially warm players up to a mechanic that will become very important later in the game. Her fight also has a ton of Scarab bots running around as ads, which I personally hate, as I would much rather just have a good one-on-one fight with a strong opponent, but they aren't annoying enough for me to say that it ruins the fight. At the end of the fight, we freeze her with what seems to be liquid nitrogen before using blade mode to hack her to bits. But again, we get one final transmission from her as she dies, with her telling the leader of the terrorists that she loves him before the signal drops. We pick up her radio to tell him to surrender, but he responds that we're exactly where he wants us to be. We look out over a railing to see him standing on top of some sort of fuel tank, saying that he's going to free the people of Abkhaz and blowing himself up along with the tank. Boris calls in, telling us that he's sending in a helicopter to pick us up, and we fade out to the mission ranking screen. I haven't mentioned these yet, and if you've seen my Peace Walker review, then you might recall my praise of the mission rank system in that game, but it's even better in a character action title like Metal Gear Rising. Every single encounter throughout the levels in these games will give you a letter grade based on things like how quickly you can take out the enemies, how much damage you take, how long your combos last, and how many Zandatsus you pull off. At the end of a mission, all of these encounter ranks are then averaged out to give you your total mission rank. These are games that are quite literally built around skill expression and stylish play, so having a ranking system like this not only encourages players to engage with the game on a deeper level, but also adds a ton of replayability in the process. Funny enough, as I'm making this video, I've been streaming my journey to S-rank every level of every Devil May Cry game right here on the channel, so trust me, a simple system like this really does add a lot to the game. After the end of the first proper mission, we also see the shop open up, allowing us to use the credits we earn while playing to buy things like new moves, weapons, and even skins for Raiden. This shop further encourages players to play well and earn higher ranks, as higher ranks will lead to more credits being earned, and of course, more credits means more upgrades. There's not a whole lot to really talk about with the shop, but there are some really fun things that you can buy, like a skin that turns you into Grey Fox from MGS1, complete with being able to replace your HF blade with his signature Fox blade. Back to the story though, we cut to Raiden arriving in Mexico with an amazing disguise to help him blend in, as well as a repaired and reprogrammed Blade Wolf at his side. Kev tells us that we need to make our way down into the sewers, so we find an appropriate entry point and make our way down.
Adios, amigos. ¿Viste? Qué raro, ¿eh? Hay que hacer que no lo vimos. Vámonos ya.
Once down there, he calls us back, telling us that our mission is to investigate a Desperado research center located somewhere in the area. They're supposedly working with the cartels and human trafficking, so our client wants us to infiltrate the lab and get whatever information we can back to them. Raiden asks what kind of research they're doing there, to which Kev says that we don't know, but they could potentially be experimenting on some of the people they're trafficking. And starting with this mission, players also now have access to the custom weapons system. This allows you to take signature weapons from bosses and use them for yourself, with the first of these being Mistral's polearm. When you have a custom weapon equipped, it will simply take the place of your heavy attacks, meaning you can still swing Raiden's HF blade by pressing X, but now when you press Y, you'll get attacks and combo strings with Mistral's polearm instead. The polearm is heavily geared towards crowd control, with large sweeping swings that can hit multiple enemies at once, and it makes combos with this thing incredibly satisfying. It also has a ton of moves and combo strings at its disposal, meaning that the amount of options you have at any given time is actually expanded while using it, despite losing all of the HF blade's heavy attacks. Its only real downside is that using it is very committal, as all of its attacks last for a pretty long time and can't be cancelled out of, meaning you'll need to get a feel for when you can and can't use its attacks before you can really get a lot out of it. Overall though, it's a great weapon, and you'll definitely find no shortage of it appearing in my footage. As we move through the sewers, we eventually find a boy being attacked by scarab bots, with Raiden jumping in for the save. We clear out all of the drones in the area, checking in to make sure that the boy is alright. He introduces himself as George and tells us about the research lab that's down here in the sewers, explaining that he was offered a job on the streets before being kidnapped and brought to the lab along with a large number of other children. He says that he overheard what they planned to do with the kids, saying that they were going to kill them and harvest their organs. Raiden asks him to explain how he escaped, and we learn that he managed to get into the sewers through the drainage channel. We also learn that some sort of Desperado executive visited the lab the day before, so if we can find a video log of that, we should be able to get all the evidence we need of what they're doing here. We tell George to sit tight and have Maverick send a squad to pick him up, continuing on to the lab. We eventually find the entrance to the lab behind an illusory wall, fighting our way in and finding an entire haul of preserved brains from the children they've been trafficking. We get a call from Boris, and Raiden fills him in on what we found before realizing that they're going to use those brains to make more cyborg soldiers, saying that he has to find the other kids George was brought in with before it's too late. We find a scarab bot, connecting to it so we can control it remotely, and we get this fun little segment where we use the bot to sneak around and look for info. The gameplay here is incredibly simple, with us basically just being able to run around and silently take down guards, but the fan service aspect of getting to control one of these is definitely fun enough to carry the section for the few minutes that it lasts. We eventually find a data terminal, using it to access the lab's server, and we come across a video of the large cyborg from the opening visiting the lab. He tells a scientist that they've already put the brains on VR training, saying that they're using the Sears program, the same VR program that Solidus Snake used to train his child soldiers in Liberia. He tells the scientist that they need to speed up their work here, saying that some people have been snooping around lately, and they need things to be finished before they're found out. The scientist tells him that their work isn't that simple and can't really be rushed, and the mysterious man with the cyborg tells him to just send over what they have now and destroy any of the unused inventory. The scientist doesn't seem to like the idea of just killing the children for no reason, but the man tells him that since these were all vagrant children, they're simply providing a service to both them and the cities that they burden. Eventually, the scientist agrees, saying that they'll dispose of the remaining inventory as soon as they can confirm the payment has been made, and he goes to walk the man and the cyborg out of the lab. We get on a call with Kev, who tells us that the cyborg is known as Sundowner and that he's Desperado's chief of operations. Raiden asks him about the strange man in the suit, and Kev says that he seemed familiar, but we'll have to give him some time to figure out exactly who it was. So, while Kev is doing that, we go to find the rest of the kids in the hopes that the payment hasn't cleared yet. As we move through the lab, we get a call from our data specialist Courtney saying that they weren't able to find George, and she wants to make sure that we got the coordinates right. Raiden tells her that he knows those coordinates were right, and she says that she'll have our men sweep the area to try to find him. Just after this, we get a seemingly insignificant mini-boss fight against an enemy known as the Grodd, but I want you to keep this thing in mind as it will actually be important in a few minutes. After we defeat it, we get a call from Kev, who tells us that he's figured out who the man in the suit was. He explains that his name is Stephen Armstrong and that he's a senator from the state of Colorado. He also tells us that there was a federal investigation 2 years ago into his involvement with a PMC group known as World Marshal. He says that that answers the question of who's offering all of Desperado's financing, and Raiden jokes that that should make for some fun headlines, but Kev explains that no one will be willing to cover a story about a US senator and a large PMC group, as it would be career suicide for any journalist. Raiden says that if no one else will expose this, then we'll need to stop them ourselves, but Kev tells us that we can't just waltz into Colorado and attack World Marshal. Raiden says that we'll figure out what to do once the kids are safe, and we hang up on Kev to continue further into the lab. We eventually find where the children are being held, but as we arrive, the chamber they're in starts to fill with gas. We're then suddenly told to freeze, and we turn around to see a scientist holding George at gunpoint. He tells us that if we try to break the glass to the chamber, he'll shoot George, saying that we need to either surrender or decide between saving all of the children or saving George. George tells us not to worry about him though, so Raiden asks him if he's sure, and he says that he's ready to die if it means killing the scientist and saving the rest of the kids. So Raiden runs across the room, slashing at the scientist and presumably hitting both of them, but we can't exactly have a kid getting sliced open in our video game, so the camera only really shows the scientist going down, and the screen fades to black. We then cut to Raiden driving into Denver, which is the capital of Colorado for all of my non-Americans out there, getting a call from George, who has apparently been fixed up with an artificial arm. He says that he heard we were going to attack a base, asking why Raiden didn't bring him along, and Raiden tells him that killing isn't just fun in games. A police car then suddenly pulls up alongside us, shooting at our driver's side window and telling us to pull over. We get into a high-speed chase with the cops, and Boris calls, asking Raiden why he would resign from Maverick. Raiden tells him that he didn't want his little corporate raid here to affect Maverick, saying that he can't just sit by while they kill kids and ship their organs around like meat. Boris argues that it's all being done legally, and Raiden tells him that just because it's legal doesn't make it right, hanging up on Boris to focus on the chase. We're eventually hit by an RPG, sending our car flying into a crash, and we're confronted by a police captain who definitely bit off more than he could chew.
183-104.7, threatening a peace officer. Deadly force is authorized.
As I'm fighting my way through the streets of Denver, it dawned on me just how good the progression in this game is. Not only is there a great sense of player progression through the new moves and weapons that I mentioned earlier, but the scaling of enemy threats throughout the campaign is fantastic as well. We're a few levels into the campaign now, and we start to get more heavily armored enemies who are capable of doing things like charging through our attacks or parrying our parry, ensuring that players don't grow too comfortable and just spam buttons through the whole game. And remember when I told you that mini-boss from earlier would be important? Well, that's because starting with this mission, it's brought back again and again as just a regular enemy throughout the rest of the campaign. We even see mass production versions of Blade Wolf from time to time as well, allowing players to see how much stronger they've become not just with their upgrades, but also with how far their skills have come from those earlier parts of the game. It's really good stuff, and in terms of the enemies specifically, really makes the progression of difficulty here in Metal Gear Rising better than it is in the majority of Metal Gear games. That being said though, I don't love every enemy that MGR has to offer. Like I briefly mentioned just a minute ago, a lot of enemies past the halfway point of the game have the ability to armor through your attacks, as well as unblockable attacks that require you to either run away from or jump over rather than just block or parry. When these enemies are thrown at the player, they actively restrict the amount of options available to them, taking a very fluid and free-flowing system and turning it into a more rigid and reaction-based system. This is an issue that pops up in a lot of character action games, and every time it does, it always starts a bit of a debate among players. Some players believe that there should be enemies that limit your options and force you to play differently, while others think that a core strength of the genre is the amount of options given to the player and the freedom to experiment with those options as you please. And personally, I believe that both of those statements are true, so I'm somewhere in the middle of these two camps. In terms of Metal Gear Rising specifically, I think that enemies not always being stunned by your attacks is fine, as it forces players to learn when it's their turn and when it's not, but I find the presence of unblockable attacks to be very annoying for one key reason. This game doesn't have a dodge feature. When presented with an unblockable, your best option is always to awkwardly turn around and ninja run away from the enemy. If this game had a dodge roll similar to something like Devil May Cry, unblockables would have been completely fine, as they wouldn't have disrupted the flow of combat, but unfortunately, it doesn't. Overall, I'm pretty mixed on MGR's enemy design past the halfway point, but your mileage here will vary greatly based on your beliefs of what is and isn't good game design. As we're moving through the city, Jetstream Sam suddenly appears on all of the screens around us. He mocks Raiden, saying that he's the child soldier fighting for the children, and that he and his little sword are going to fix everything. Raiden tells him that the purpose of his sword is to protect those that he preys on, and Sam asks him if he's ever thought about how the cyborgs he's chopping into hamburger are still people. Raiden says that they've made their choice, but Sam tells him that a lot of the time, they sign up for PMCs out of desperation to be able to get life-saving surgeries or provide for their families. He tells Raiden to listen to the battlefield emotions that their nanomachines suppress, and we start to hear the desperation and the fear of the enemy cyborg's inner thoughts as we fight them. Hearing these emotions throws Raiden off enough for them to get some good hits in, and he eventually pulls himself together enough to defend himself, but the realization that these people didn't have a fair choice is starting to cripple him. Blade Wolf then walks up, saying that Sam's behaviors aren't consistent with his established parameters, revealing that the two of them had worked together on previous operations before we took him in. Wolf continues on to scout ahead, and we make our way to the entrance of World Marshal's headquarters. Once there, we get our ass beat by the cyborg standing guard before Sam walks out of the front door, continuing to mock us. Another cyborg then comes in, calling us Jack the Ripper and introducing himself as Monsoon. We see that his body can split apart and reconnect using some sort of magnets before he joins in with Sam, chastising us for ignoring the lives that we've been taking. Raiden argues that they're the ones exploiting these men, saying that it's only natural they get hurt when Desperado uses them as human shields. Monsoon then lectures Raiden on what truly drives humanity to do the things that they do.
Memes, the DNA of the soul.
He continues to make fun of the idea that Raiden's sword is a tool to protect the weak, drawing his weapons and saying that we can die with a clear conscience. Raiden says that they were right about him and that this was never about justice or protecting the weak. Rather, it's his past as a child soldier resurfacing, and that whole protect the weak bit was just a way for him to keep the Ripper in check. He then stands up, allowing one of the cyborgs to stab him through the abdomen and telling Doctor to
Turn off my pain inhibitors.
reawakening the brutal killer inside himself through the pain. Sam goes off to report back to the chief, and we get into a fight against Monsoon, giving us our 4th boss fight of the game. His fight is definitely one of the most interesting the game has offered so far, and it's mostly because of the new skills that it demands of the player. Now, instead of players simply needing to block the occasional attack, Monsoon has various flurries of quick attacks, with each attack in these strings needing to be blocked individually, requiring players to learn how to block multiple times in succession. He also occasionally enters a state where he'll split his body into pieces to dodge your attacks, and will remain in this state until you can hit a perfect parry, quickly followed by an accurate Zandatsu swing to the head. If the player is able to pull this off, he'll also fall apart for a short time, leaving his head totally exposed to damage, just giving players an additional reward for really mastering these mechanics. His magnetic powers don't seem to end at splitting his own body apart, however, as he'll also occasionally jump up to a vantage point in the arena and throw large metal objects like cars and helicopters down at the player, requiring you to use blade mode to defend yourself. It's easily the most demanding boss fight in the game so far, but it's also the most dynamic as a result, leading to a very rewarding encounter. Oh, and that boss theme as well. At first, I really wasn't a fan of Raiden sort of reverting back to this Ripper persona, but if you listen to the optional codec calls that are available right after this, you'll learn that he didn't entirely revert to his former self. Rather, it's more accurate to say that he gave in to old habits for a brief moment. And that brings us to one of the largest flaws of Metal Gear Rising's storytelling in my opinion, and that's the fact that almost all of Raiden's character development in this game is done entirely through these optional calls. The Metal Gear games have had these really high quality codec calls ever since MGS1, but they've never been mandatory for understanding the basic character arc of the protagonist during the game quite like they are here in Rising. I'm not going to dig too deep into all these extra calls, as there's a lot of them, and my Metal Gear videos have a tendency to run on the long side anyway, but if you want to fully understand Raiden's character here in MGR, make sure that you either listen to all of these extra calls when playing the game for yourself, or just simply look up a compilation of them here on YouTube. But from this point on, players now have access to a new mechanic in the form of Ripper mode. This can only be activated when Raiden's energy bar is full, which will be very clearly indicated by the bar turning red, but when activated, it makes Raiden's attacks incredibly lethal. Instead of slowly chipping away at enemies through your combos, you'll instead be chopping off limbs in 1 or 2 hits, and this even works against the strongest regular enemies the game has to throw at you. This is incredibly overpowered and allows players to almost instantly clear rooms, but there are a couple downsides to using it. The first and more minor of these is that since you'll be killing enemies so quickly, you won't really be building up any combos, so your mission ranks are gonna fall pretty drastically if you choose to abuse Ripper mode regularly. The other, and much more impactful downside, is that because enemies die so quickly, you won't be able to get any Zandatsus off. This might sound like a bit of a non-issue, but you really don't realize just how useful fully healing yourself off of enemy kills actually is until you start to use Ripper mode and have it taken away from you. It's an incredibly powerful ability that can be used to instantly cheese your way through any encounter in the game, but the couple of downsides that it has actually pushed me away from using it and into working harder to improve at the game, so I would have to say that it's been implemented pretty beautifully here. Along with that, we now have access to Monsoon's Sai as a custom weapon, but I have to say that this is a pretty disappointing weapon. It has a grand total of 2 attacks in its arsenal, and the second of these is a follow-up attack to the first, meaning that the weapon really only has 1 use. That being said though, that 1 use is pretty unique compared to the rest of the weapons in MGR, as you can use the Sai to pull yourself straight to an enemy, which not only adds a solid mobility option for combos in general, but also helps in those very annoying fights against aerial enemies. I wish I could love this weapon, as the ability to pull yourself straight to an enemy from across the arena is a really great one, but that is quite literally all that this weapon is capable of. And since having a custom weapon equipped removes your access to the HF Blade's heavy attacks, the Sai ultimately just limits your combo potential too much to justify using it over other weapons. Continuing on though, we get a level where we slowly ascend up the headquarters building with a lot of fun set pieces like getting ambushed by Gecko in the offices, running up the side of the building, and even finding that one of the executives was obsessed with Japanese culture and fighting through a floor of the building that's been made to look like a traditional Japanese garden. There's also a room in this level where we fight duplicates of both Mistral and Monsoon, but I can't really wrap my head around why these are here, other than to maybe just pad out the game a little bit. I thought that they might have been added in because the devs didn't think this level was exciting enough as it is, but I would say that this level actually has the most diverse and exciting set pieces of the entire campaign, so I'm not super confident that that's the case. It's kind of a stupid inclusion, but the boss fights are both fun and short enough that it's not really an annoyance, just a bit of a weird thing to add here. We eventually get up to the top of the tower, and Sundowner reveals himself, telling us not to disrupt the students while class is in session. He tells Raiden that it's the same program he went through as a child in Liberia, except that now they're running them through it digitally by wiring straight to their brain and hitting the pleasure centers in the brains every time they kill. Raiden condemns him, saying that they're just kids, but Sundowner argues that all people are born cruel and simply lose their touch with it as they get older. He tells Raiden that children are the easiest to manipulate into committing atrocities, saying that there's nothing like a good atrocity to keep a war going. He also tells him that even if we bring this whole place down and escape with the brains, nothing is actually going to change, as all the guys in charge will just start up again somewhere else. He says that war is just part of human nature, before telling Raiden that none of this will even matter in 3 hours, as the demand for PMCs is about to skyrocket back to the days of 9/11. Raiden asks him what he means by that, but he simply walks out of the room, so we chase him out onto the rooftop. He says that we can play up here without damaging the merchandise, and Raiden asks him what's about to happen, but he says that it doesn't matter, as even if we traveled at Mach 2, we wouldn't be able to get there and stop it in time. On top of that, he says that killing us is going to take some time, telling us that
Kids are cool, Jackie. And I'm very in touch with my inner child.
And I have to say, having a villain like Sundowner in this game is so refreshing. Metal Gear villains always have some larger purpose or core belief driving them that they use to attempt to justify their actions, and don't get me wrong, it's always done very well in this series, but it's a nice change of pace to have a man like Sundowner who legitimately is just evil for the sake of being evil and wants to watch the world burn. Anyway, we get into a boss fight against him, and this is easily one of my favorites in the game. It requires us to make use of all the skills that we've learned previously, but it takes the idea of accurate Zandatsus even further with the use of his shields. See, when he deploys these things, the only way to get him to drop them is to accurately slash across the designated line, and if you hit the shield anywhere else outside of that line, you'll be eating a small explosion to the face in return. Occasionally, he'll also charge at the player, and if you manage to block the attack in time, you'll be given an opening where you can slash at the arms the shields are mounted on, removing them from the fight one by one. To make things even better, it's a genuine one-on-one fight with no interruptions, and he has what might be my favorite boss track in the game as well. Once we've done enough damage to him, he falls backwards off the building before a helicopter pulls up, revealing that he's not dead yet and shooting some missiles at us. Raiden starts to fall from the building, but manages to hijack a flying drone on the way down, giving us a crazy sequence where we fly back up through one of the building's collapsing elevator shafts, using blade mode to slice our way through the ceiling and throwing the drone at the helicopter, leading to him getting launched at us and allowing us to dice him up real good. We of course get one last signal from him as he dies, and Raiden asks him one more time what happens in 3 hours. Sundowner responds that he'll be launching Operation Tecumseh, with Raiden asking if he means Armstrong, but he says that he's already said too much and that it's up to Sam now before we lose the signal. We get a call from Boris and Kev, who are also trying to figure out what's going to happen in a few hours. They deduce that if Mach 2 couldn't be fast enough to get there in time, it can't be on American soil, and Kev mentions that it would have to be in a political hotspot in order to spike demand for PMCs, before Raiden realizes that the president has a meeting in Pakistan today. He tells them to contact the military, but Boris says that it would take too long to get through to anyone with enough authority, and no one's going to believe us over World Marshal anyway. Courtney then joins in, saying that we could get there in time if we use a low atmosphere spacecraft, so Raiden tells them to contact the nearby launch station. After a bit, Doctor comes to pick us up by helicopter and bring us to the launch site, but just after we take off, we're suddenly attacked by 2 unmanned jets. Raiden tells him that he'll handle it, getting up and jumping out the side door of the chopper, landing on top of one of the drones. He stabs it with his blade, taking control of the AI, and Doctor brings the chopper around, luring the other jet straight to us so that Raiden can slice it clean in half. How fucking ridiculous is this game? It's just so stupid, and I love it. We jump from the drone back to Doctor's chopper, catching ourselves on some of the railing along the side, but the rail then suddenly breaks off, and we plummet back down into the streets of Denver. Doctor tries to pull around and pick us up, but World Marshal forces on the streets are armed with RPGs, so he's forced to fly out of the city without us. We wake up in a small crater down on the streets, and we get a level where we have to escape from Denver on foot. This is the one level in the game that really feels like it's here just to pad out the runtime, as it's a simple backtrack of the streets level from earlier with nothing new being added, aside from the fact that we now have access to Sundowner's large pincer blades, which are fine, I guess. They're built around the idea of having a big, slow-swinging weapon that hits really hard, and they're good at that, but without being able to animation cancel, there aren't many opportunities to actually use these mid-fight. When you do find an opportunity to use them, they can be incredibly satisfying, especially with the additional gimmick they have where you can hold the input to charge up the swing for more damage. The moveset is much more fleshed out than that of the Sai, but the long windups just make them really difficult to use properly, so I found myself underwhelmed once again. And not to spoil the next couple bosses by any means, but this is the last custom weapon on offer. Overall, the Sai and the pincer blades do have their uses in certain situations, but neither of them really justify the loss of the HF blade's heavy attacks, and the polearm is just a fantastic weapon in almost any situation, so while I was really excited about the unique weapons at first, I found them to be a little disappointing on the whole. Eventually though, we end up finding a motorcycle parked on the side of the street, and we take it so that we can reach the launch site in time. As we're driving down the highway, we come across Sam and Wolf sitting in the middle of the road, and Wolf walks over to us, saying that he can't figure out what Sam's motivations are. Raiden tells Sam that he should thank him for not killing everyone at the launch site, to which Sam responds that the war is the big payoff here. Raiden mocks him, saying that everyone at World Marshal will get big bonuses once the war starts, but Sam says that he's not talking about money, rather he's talking about ideals. Raiden asks what he means, and he says that he's sure that we've heard enough speeches about higher causes by now, simply saying that history will decide which one of us is right. We get off our motorcycle, walking off the road with him, and getting our long-awaited rematch with Jetstream Sam. This is yet another great boss, with Sam once again requiring players to use all of the skills that they've learned up to this point, but adding in a new massive lesson in the form of patience. Much like Raiden, Sam can parry our attacks and earn himself a guaranteed counterattack, and that's only the tip of the iceberg here. After dealing a decent amount of damage, players can disarm Sam, and in this unarmed state of his, he can actually punish players for attempting to use any sort of dash strike on him, forcing players into taking a more slow and deliberate approach to the fight. Along with this, he also has some incredibly mobile moves that see him closing the gap between the two of you in an instant, like a large leaping attack or his signature unsheathing technique that we saw at the beginning of the game. This is a super interesting direction to take his boss fight in, as it takes it from feeling like an all-out battle to the death with a terrorist to feeling more like a calculated duel with a fellow expert swordsman. And once his health is low, we knock him off balance with a quick Zandatsu, stabbing him through the chest for the kill. After he dies, we realize that Sam actually had very minimal cyborg enhancements, and Wolf asks us if this outcome was really necessary. He says that human conflict stems from differing ideals, but that he was never programmed with ideals of his own, and Raiden tells him that it's best if he figures out what he believes in for himself. We walk over to Sam and pick up his blade, finding that it's ID locked, and Wolf asks Raiden if he can keep it in memory of Sam. So Raiden takes the blade and sheaths it in traditional samurai form, handing it to Wolf to hold onto before continuing on to the launch site. Once we arrive, we're greeted at the gate by Sunny, who's apparently seeing Raiden for the first time in a few years. She says that we don't really have time to catch up, telling us to follow her, and she shows us the craft that we're going up in, revealing that she designed and built it for the company. We get in with Wolf, and we're launched off to Pakistan. We cut to our arrival at the airbase, but Raiden isn't sure if it's the right place since we don't see anything unusual going on. We head in, fighting our way through the guards along the way, and Raiden notices that the guards have their identification codes set to the same illegal code that Desperado uses, making it look like Desperado hacked the soldiers on site, likely so they can blame this as an attack on the US once they've killed the president. We continue through the base, eventually coming across Wolf, who seems to be injured, and just then, the ground starts to suddenly fall out from under us, and Raiden barely manages to escape from getting stuck in the hole. A new metal gear arises from the hole, and we see Senator Armstrong step out of the cockpit up top.
Well, if it isn't Saucy Jack.
Raiden tells him that his plan ends here, but he argues that we're not ending his plan, rather we're expanding it. Just then, Boris calls us, saying that Air Force One is turning back to the States, and revealing that pictures of the dead guards on the base have leaked online, which has the internet up in arms calling for a war with Pakistan. Armstrong tells us that this is just the excuse they've been waiting for, and that even with the Patriots gone, their legacy still lingers on 4 years later.
The memes.
He explains that the two things that politicians need to do to win over the American public is convince them that they're part of the greatest nation on earth and keep the economy humming along, explaining that he's starting a new war to jumpstart said economy. Raiden mocks him, saying that all they need to do is grease the gears with a little innocent blood, but Armstrong argues that it's not innocent blood, it's a war on terror. He then tells us that he can't have any eyewitness reports complicating the message, getting back into the Metal Gear and firing it up for another boss fight. And I have to say, Metal Gear Excelsus is the only boss in this game that I don't love. At first, I tried every way that the game previously taught to avoid attacks, from running away from them, to blocking or parrying, to jumping over them, whatever, but I was just never able to find a totally consistent way to avoid damage here. Almost every attack in this fight is blockable, but you'll still take a pretty decent chunk of chip damage on a successful block, so if that is the intended method of dealing with this boss, then you better hope you've upgraded your health bar or brought in some consumable healing items. I ultimately didn't have a problem with getting through the fight, as it only took me a couple tries to actually beat, but it's just the one fight in the game that didn't give me the satisfaction of overcoming it through my own skill. Rather, it just felt like I kind of drifted through it without really understanding it. Once we've depleted its health though, we tear off one of its giant blade arms, using it to have a goddamn sword fight with the thing, before then using it alongside blade mode to properly destroy Excelsus. Once we're done with that, Armstrong steps out of the cockpit again, seemingly absorbing the energy from what remains of Metal Gear Excelsus and becoming so incredibly jacked that he's literally ripping through his shirt. He then runs over, absolutely dominating Raiden physically and beating the living shit out of him.
Don't fuck with this, Senator!
We try to fight him, but he just tanks through whatever damage we throw at him, hitting us back with attacks that still deal damage even through successful blocks. Eventually, he catches our blade, breaking it in two just by squeezing it in one hand and continuing to pummel Raiden. Raiden tells him that he's a typical politician, making big promises with nothing to back them up. He says that all Armstrong really cares about is lining his own pockets and his approval ratings, telling him that if America's gone to shit, he's just another maggot in the pile. Which is actually a really good one. I need to write that down. Armstrong tells him that he's right and that he does need money and votes, but that they're all in service of seeing through his dream that every man in America will truly be free and in control of their own destiny. He says that America is rotten to the core and that they need to burn it all down and wipe the slate clean, saying that the weak will be purged, but the strong will thrive, and once that happens, America will be great again. No, I'm not bullshitting. He actually says that. And this was years before this guy ever even announced that he was getting into politics. And people say that Kojima is the one making weird predictions. Armstrong then says that in his new America, people will kill and die for what they believe in, and tells Raiden that he should fight for what he believes in. Raiden says that he might have been wrong about him, and we get this wholesome little embrace between the two before Raiden yells that he's batshit insane, attacking him yet again. He asks Armstrong what he would know about the weak, saying that he doesn't know what it's like to fight, steal, and kill just to survive. Armstrong argues, however, that Raiden does know what it's like and that somehow he still came out successful. We try to fight him hand to hand, but once again, he just seems to absolutely dominate Raiden in a fair fight.
Why won't you die? Nanomachine, son!
Armstrong then pins Raiden down, and as he starts to beat on him, we see something on Sam's blade activate, causing Wolf to wake up. Armstrong then hits Raiden so goddamn hard that it causes what's left of Excelsus to blow up, and as he walks over to finish Raiden off, Wolf calls out to us. He plays back a recording of Sam saying that he's going to leave things to fate, revealing that Sam was perfectly happy dying if Raiden could prove that he was the stronger man, and in the event that that happens, the ID lock on Sam's blade will be released after a couple of hours. Armstrong tells Wolf that once he's done with Raiden, he'll destroy him next, but Wolf responds that he doesn't fear termination, saying that he's learned from Raiden and established his own directives to follow. Armstrong leaps over to him, but Wolf manages to toss the blade to Raiden in time, and we draw Sam's blade, preparing for the final battle with Armstrong. Here, we get the real Armstrong boss fight, and it's a damn good one. It calls back to everything we've learned throughout the game, including building even further upon the patience and spacing that Sam's fight taught us. He has a massive health bar, but using every trick in the book to avoid taking damage and slowly chipping away at his health bar is incredibly satisfying once you're in the rhythm of it, and the fight easily has some of the coolest QTEs and blade mode sequences that the game has to offer as well. It's an absolute blast of a boss fight, and if you're still somehow on the fence about whether you should play or replay this game for yourself, I would say that it's worth it just for the insane dopamine rush of this fight alone. Once his health is low, we get one last Zandatsu test, requiring us to slash him across his heart repeatedly, before Raiden quite literally punches a hole into his chest. Raiden tells him that his dream dies with him, but he argues that Raiden is guaranteed that war will continue to be a standard part of human life for a while longer at least, saying that in death, he'll at least be leaving behind a worthy successor. He tells Raiden that he carves his own path, using whatever means necessary to do so, not letting legal and political bullshit get in the way, and Raiden proceeds to quite literally rip out his still beating heart and crush it in his hands. In his dying breaths, Armstrong says that he and Raiden are kindred spirits deep down, and we're left with this haunting shot of Raiden realizing just how right he actually is. We then get a little wrap up to all the side characters in the story, with Doc calling Kev and Courtney and telling them that they're approved to open the world's first cyborg staffing firm, which they're starting to help the children that they rescued from World Marshall get a basic education, learn a trade, and find a purpose in life. We also see that George has a new job, helping Sunny out with stuff at the launch site, and we also see that she adopted Blade Wolf before the credits roll. Of course, we get a post-credits scene of a conversation between Boris and Raiden, with Boris telling him that even though they shut down the brain harvesting operation, World Marshall is still a prospering company. He asks Raiden if he'll come back to Maverick, but Raiden tells him that he's already made up his mind, and we see him doing a bit of his own vigilante work, saying that he has his own war to fight. Ultimately, the story of Metal Gear Rising is really fun, and it certainly has its moments, but it's not exactly up to the standard that Metal Gear fans would have come to expect at this point. There are a lot of themes crammed into this game's really short runtime, and a lot of them aren't really given enough room to breathe. The themes that are given enough screen time end up being used really well, but a lot of them are crushed under the writer's overambition. If nothing else, MGR's story really shines through its characters, with Raiden, Blade Wolf, Sundowner, Jetstream Sam, and Senator Armstrong being some of the most likable protagonists and antagonists the Metal Gear franchise has ever seen. The story isn't one of Metal Gear's best, but it is really fun for what it is, and if I may be so bold, I think that if you're playing Metal Gear Rising for the story alone, you're frankly playing it for the wrong reasons. And on that note, I had an absolute blast with Metal Gear Rising. It might not be the shining example of video games as an art form like the best of the Metal Gear franchise, but it's an incredibly fun action game with outstanding characters and a soundtrack that's nothing short of phenomenal. The game truly shines in its combat and its core gameplay design, making it an experience that's hard to put down from beginning to end. And due to its short runtime of about 7 hours, it's a game that, at least if you're like me, will leave you sad that it's over and still wanting more. Luckily, if you play the game nowadays through digital vendors like Steam, the game comes with 2 DLCs packaged along with the base product for free, where you get to play as Jetstream Sam and Blade Wolf respectively, and while I didn't cover them in this video, I absolutely plan to go back and play through them for myself sometime. The game has only continued to become more and more popular as time goes on, and while a lot of people attribute this to the memes the game has produced, I think that that's only scratching the surface. Sure, people are exposed to MGR for the first time and become interested in the game through the memes, but if the game wasn't actually good, that popularity would fade away very quickly. The reason the game continues to rise in popularity is because the new players who do check the game out fall in love with its gameplay and its characters, which only further improves the game's reputation and increases the number of people singing its praises. Like I said earlier, if you haven't played the game for yourself and you're still unsure about whether you should or shouldn't, I would encourage you to check it out. It's a game that has its flaws for sure, but it's such a lovingly crafted and unique experience, and trust me, when you start taking down those epic bosses with the amazing soundtrack blaring in the background, you'll start to truly understand why the game has continued to grow in popularity over the years. It's such a unique and refreshing title in the larger gaming landscape, and even if you've never played a proper Metal Gear game before, this could be your gateway, just like it has been for so many other people. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance an 8 out of 10. Hey guys, thanks for swinging by. Real quick, before you go, I would like to mention that I have a poll linked in the comments below where you can vote on what sort of game series you would like to see me cover here on the channel in the near future. There's a ton of games on there, and you're allowed to vote for as many as you like, so instead of just finding and voting for your one favorite, feel free to just throw a vote on literally any games that you would like to watch a series like this of. I would also like to give a massive thank you to my supporters both on Patreon and through YouTube memberships. YouTube ad revenue is notoriously inconsistent, and I've even had some problems with this video specifically, so their generosity really helps keep the channel running smoothly, and I can't thank them enough. With all that said though, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope to see all of you right here for the next Metal Gear review.